Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to the class. So this is about our Korean ancestors. So ancestors and lineage and Inca and transmission and all that kind of stuff. Um, to me was always quite interesting because I have been like, you're in academic traditions and lineages. You have a family lineage, like people are always going on 23andMe and trying to figure out their genetic lineage or something, right? So you're always interested in kind of this hand-me-down kind of thing. And it's a technique that's used in many traditions. Like when I was in academia, I was studying with somebody who was the student of somebody, and then I can't remember who it was. Oh, I was studying Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher.
Yeah.
Don't remember that I said this. And his teacher was, so he had a teacher too, right? So they go through these lineages. Like you might not want to remember your teacher, or you might want to forego them, or don't tell anybody about them. But it's just a way that human beings learn or come to recognize things. Or in the Zen tradition, um, it's a technique that allows you to confront this big question of life and death. So everything in Zen ultimately is about finding your true self and helping the world. So our first lineage holder, of course, would be the Buddha. So uh, before he dies, there's always this kind of like handing down process. Like maybe your grandfather handed down some antiques to your mother, and then your mother gave them to you, and now you've got them in the break front there in the living room, and you look at them and blah 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 blah, right? So it's a standard human style technique, and we call it a lineage, right? So this lineage does several different things. One thing it does is it kind of legitimates or certifies, like Inca, like this stamp is is an old Chinese tradition where they would stamp things and make this impression in wax that was put on the envelope of a document to let you know that the document that's inside is the real deal, right? So this ink or this transmission is all a certification of this is the real thing on some level. You don't know what level, but because you don't know what it's about. So at least it's certified. So this is a kind of technique for teaching, right? So one way to think about Zen masters or patriarchs or matriarchs or whatever you call them is that they're all a kind of teaching technique. So as you probably notice, if you read about the Buddha, he had a lot of trouble figuring out what the heck was going on. And then he had even more trouble when he went to hand it on to other people. In fact, it said he just kept sitting underneath the Bodhi tree saying, nobody's going to believe this, right? So a God had to float down out of heaven and say, hey, wait a minute. You got to get up from your wonderful seat there underneath the tree and actually teach somebody, right? Tell people about it. Because, and the God said, well, he already knew that Buddha knew this, that there are some people who are going to listen, right? So one thing that you're concerned about when you're doing teaching is that some people will listen. After all, if I gave a class up here at the university and nobody signed up for it, and the people that did come and signed up for it are just on their phones, they never listened to anything I said. So why have that class, right? if you're a teacher, you probably already encountered that situation. You're lucky if half the people there are awake, and if half the people that are awake are listening, you're like the best teacher ever in the world. So Socrates has his followers. Um, the Buddha has his followers. Jesus has his followers. So those all are take place in particular cultural contexts, right? So uh, if you have a Greek transmission of philosophy, or you have a Christian transmission down from Jesus, uh, maybe they're called popes or whatever they're called. I was raised in a Protestant tradition, so there is Martin Luther and there's John Calvin, but that's about it. Everybody else is just kind of like a preacher. But they don't they study and stuff, but they don't, they're never asked the question, did you really meet God? Do you really know God? Did God approve of you to open your mouth? They don't have that in the Christian tradition so much. But in the Buddhist tradition, we do have that, right? So this works out really well while Buddha is alive, but after he goes into what we call parinirvana, after he leaves, there's some dispute about whether the first so-called patriarch, the first ancestor, is Ananda, or whether it's Mahakashyapa. So we're in the Mahayana tradition. So the first ancestor is Mahakashyapa. So then that's handed down from teacher to teacher to teacher to teacher to teacher. So now it's been going on for 2,600 years. And those teachers also have students. And so there's many branches to this thing. Like here in the United States, we don't encounter those other branches too much, but I live for most of the last 10 years, I lived in Singapore. So there's also this thing called the Theravadan tradition. So you can spot them really easy because they're not wearing Chinese or Korean style robes like I'm wearing here this morning. These are actually Mongolian robes, but you can spot them really easy, and they come from a different kind of tradition that thinks that Ananda is the first so-called patriarch, and that not Mahakashyapa. I think Mahakashyapa is third or something. I don't know. I can't remember. Anyway, so that points to the fact that this is just an expedient means, and that expedient means works sometimes, and it doesn't. It's just an attempt to transmit a kind of teaching which pokes at people, provokes people, informs them, or stirs them up to try to find their true self, right? But that can happen in all kinds of things, and it doesn't even take Buddhism to do that, right? So there's many stories, even in the Korean tradition, and one of my favorite ones is this monk Sokdu, and he's called the Rockhead because he couldn't read the sutras. He even misunderstood what his teacher said to him, and he was a lineage holder. And still, boom, he wakes up, right? So what that points to is there's all these techniques floating around. It could be reading a sutra. It could be looking at your dead child who died before you even died, or it could be anything. And so these are all kind of thought up or created kinds of techniques within particular cultural contexts to provoke, transmit, bring up this great question to us. So it's all about finding your true self. Of course, you don't want to find your true self if you haven't been provoked. So your best teacher might be a dead body that you see in the street. After all, that's what happened to Buddha, right? And I know when I've seen dead bodies, like my own mother laying in a casket, inside you have this kind of feeling, and that feeling is pointing towards this great question of life and death. So a lineage holder's job, actually it's a big job, it's an inconceivable job actually, is to uh, provoke you in some way, to point it out. To it's not about instructing you the way a professor might instruct you, like, okay, this is a good book. Go memorize this book by Husserl, and then you'll understand the origins of phenomenology or something. It's not like that, or it's not like in Confucian traditions they'll memorize the Analects of Confucius, right? And in Taoist traditions, they might read the Tao Te Ching or something, but it starts out by saying the Tao that can be read about, understood, or anything is not the true Tao, right? So that points that there's something else going on here rather than memorizing text or understanding teachings. So this lineage holder, whoever they are, their job is actually to provoke you at the kind of, how would I say it, at the depths of your being to question what the heck is going on here. And the ones that really do that well, are very provocative, are actually the ones you don't like. So Zen Master Sung Sung always said, if you don't like your teacher, that's great. you're in the ballpark then, you're in the zone if you don't like that teacher. Because that teacher will start out being kind of nice and warm and fuzzy and stuff, but then later on, the worm will turn and you won't like what they're saying, right? So that's part of this tradition, which is a provocative kind of poking at you, maybe even threatening you with death in certain circumstances, uh, to get you off your seat and start to doing something. So the ones that are most famous are usually the ones that are most skilled at doing that kind of thing, right? So one thing to know about the Korean tradition is that in Korea over the years, um, all these different schools of Buddhism came to Korea. But the interesting thing is that all these other schools die out and you're only left with Zen. So it's not much different than China in the middle, I forget when it is, 848, near 848 or something, the emperor of China starts persecuting Buddhism and it's almost completely wiped out. So what's left is in China, Zen, and then these other schools are also still around. Like if you go to where I live in Singapore, our Zen center kind of hides inside of a Pure Land school. So they're always doing chant. Zen Master Sung Sung called this pray Buddhism. So in Korea, pray Buddhism is actually not so popular, which is kind of interesting. But here in the United States, we don't know so much about pray Buddhism. We know more about Zen, but we know mostly about Zen, at least in the old days, from the Japanese tradition, because Japanese teachers were the first ones to bring Zen to this country in the late 1800s, in the very late 1800s, right? So we mostly understand Zen in terms of this Japanese tradition. In fact, you'll notice in English, we use the word Zen, right? We don't use Sun, which is the Korean word, and we don't use Chan, which is the Chinese word. So we are mostly familiar with that, right? But then there's this Korean tradition too. So that transpires and is passed down within a Korean tradition. So the Korean tradition is actually much more like the Chinese tradition than it is like the Japanese tradition. Because unfortunately for the Japanese, this Zen tradition got taken up by the samurai class, the warrior class. So in the middle teens there, it became like the ideology or a training technique for a warrior class. While Zen in Korea and Buddhism in China is not associated with the warrior class. So in Korea, it might be associated with the ruling class, right? So even Daesan Sanim's teacher, Kobong Sanim, came from this ruling class. He was a Yangbang. So he's highly trained. He's a big time Confucian scholar and everything. But then he becomes a Zen monk when he gets hit by this big question. So each country, whether it's China, Japan, Korea, or now the United States, this idea of lineage is developed and progresses inside of a particular cultural tradition. So the one that we encounter is this Korean tradition, which is quite a bit different actually than the Japanese tradition, although they're both called Zen. We call it Korean Zen, right? Which probably makes old time Koreans kind of quiver because they don't like the Japanese words, right? So like when Zen Master Sung was being raised, he's a Korean born in a little village outside of Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea. He was educated and taught in Japanese, so he's perfectly fluent in Japanese. He had no problem living in Japan for 10 years, at least on the language front, although everybody would know he's a Korean, right? So, but Zen and Buddhism isn't dependent on any particular culture or language, although it is expressed in a particular culture and language. The meaning is before words, right? So that's why we always say open your mouth is already a mistake, right? Well, that just comes from Chinese Zen style. So, and from Bodhidharma, people like that, who brought this Buddhist tradition to China. So even though this teaching manifests itself within a particular cultural tradition, actually, if it was too alien, nobody would even listen to it. So this Zen tradition is actually pretty good on picking up thises and that's from the cultures that it moves to create a teaching that works for the people that live there, right? So if you go to Tibet, you'll notice that Buddhism is very closely associated with shamanism, Tibetan shamanism, right? So I studied under I knew some Tibetan teachers. Most of my friends that practice Tibetan Buddhism practice under Chogyam Trungpa, but he was very westernized. Or Zen Master Sung was friends with Chakdu Tulku Rinpoche, and he used to come to the Providence Zen Center. But he's a Tibetan, so he didn't care at the Providence Zen Center that we had vegetarian food. So we asked you have to take him out at night to eat steaks at a steakhouse in Federal Hill there in Providence, Rhode Island, right? So, but that's just Buddhism manifesting itself in different cultural traditions, So this tradition of being vegetarian isn't as strong in the Tibetan tradition as it might be in the Chinese tradition, or probably a little bit less so in the Korean tradition, and maybe not at all in the Japanese tradition. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with it. So anyway, I encounter all this stuff when I go to Korea. So I went to Korea in late 1985 to do a retreat there. So I didn't really, mostly as an American, I knew mostly about Japanese Zen. And of course, I'd studied under Zen Master Sung for 5, 6, 7 years or so. So I knew about Korean Zen. But to go there and actually be at these sites, So one time I used to lead these 90-day retreats at this temple called Shinwansa. And one interesting thing about Shinwansa was on Karyong Mountain, was the most famous Buddhist mountain in the Korean Peninsula, is that it was built in the year 526. So every time I read that sign, I was shocked. 526, you know, because I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. And nobody lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. I mean, white people until like the 1868 or something, right? So 526, you know, so that kind of what 526, but that's like towards the beginning of the Shilla dynasty, which is a unified kind of Korean dynasty that replaced the Pekche, Koryo, Shilla, and those kind of smaller kingdoms, you know, kind of mushed together, you know, a little after that actually. But so when you go there, you get this kind of feeling, wow, 526, you know, and it was built by an Indian monk. It wasn't built by a Chinese monk, right? So that's kind of interesting. So that's like a cultural context. So when you think about it, our teacher, our founding teacher, Zen Master Sungsong, is this in this lineage that goes back to a long time, right? Like even Matsu Dawi, you know, the inventor of the shout cots, or the guy that hit people with sticks. I mean, they say he invented it, but anyway, his precepts teacher was a Korean monk. So that means Korean monks have been traveling to China to learn about practice. You know, they've been there for a long time already. So this, uh, I mean, traditionally we were always taught that Buddhism came to China in the year 69. So that's around the time that the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. So some Indian monks brought these sutras and stuff to this White Horse Temple, which is near the Chinese capital of Liang. So they brought them there supposedly in the year 69. So if you go there, you can see this old, well, it's been built 1,000 times, you know, since they're always burning them down and rebuilding them. But you can go there and see that. So this is what we call lineage. So it goes way, 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 way back, and it continues on. It's always dying out all the time, you know. In Korea, it'll come and go, come and go. So this coming and going phenomena is very interesting because just a few generations back from our founding teacher, Zen Master Sungsong, is this famous Zen Master Kyung-ho Sunim. His name means empty mirror. So he rejuvenates Korean Buddhism, but Korean Buddhism is being regenerated all the time because it blossoms and it dies, blossoms, die. People invade, the Mongols come in and kill everybody in the 14th century or something, you know, so it's always going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down all the time. So what we're doing is riding a little wave it's not a little wave, it's a pretty big wave, that was produced by this teacher, Kyung Ho Sunim. So he was born in the 1850s and he dies in 1924. So he rejuvenates and brings back to life Buddhism, and particularly Zen style Buddhism, because he's a Zen teacher and in this Korean tradition of Zen. So these other schools either merge with Zen, or they die out, or they become what we call Kyo, which is this kind of sutra study school. And then there's the Zen school, and they spend a lot of time fighting with each other all the time. But these days they're merged, although they still fight. So he's in that kind of tradition. So his life story is very interesting um, because of war and stuff. His father has died. They don't know quite how, but his mother is widowed and she's poor, so she becomes a servant in a temple, and so he's born inside of a temple and raised inside of a temple. And then he's this Confucian scholar that lives there recognizes very early on that he's a quite talented person. You can read all about this in the books, but I'll just briefly say some things about it because it's kind of interesting. That they recognize that he has a real talent for poetry, for reading and writing and all kinds of things. So he becomes like this really precocious uh, scholar type person. And then he also studies Buddhist texts because he's living at a Buddhist temple. And by the age of 24, he becomes a sutra master. So usually sutra masters are probably at least 50, 60, 70 years old. And he's 24 years old. And he's teaching at this temple called Donhaksa, which is about 10 miles from our temple, Musangsa, on Karyong Mountain. It's a beautiful temple. It's a nun's temple now. So he was teaching there. And well, you've all read the story. You know, he wants to go visit his precepts teacher in Seoul. And of course, you can't take the bus or anything. So, or take a train or a plane. So he's walking up to Seoul and comes into this village and there's nobody there. And he opens the door and sees that there's all these bloated, rotting bodies inside the house. He opens the other door, sees the same thing. Then his eye catches this sign in town that says, everybody, you should all leave immediately or you'll die, cholera. Right. So that really shocks him because he understands everything about Buddhism. I mean, he's a Buddhist scholar at the age 24. So he knows everything that the Buddha said. He knows all the commentaries. He knows all the different schools. He knows everything. And yet he's scared shitless by this sign and seeing these dead people. And then on his way back to the temple, he hears a tiger roar. So in those days, there were still tigers in the woods around there. He hears one roar and again he gets scared. So again he knows, oh God, you know, if I know all this stuff, how come I'm so scared? Then it dawns on him, wait a minute, I just have understanding, I don't have attainment. So you know, always know that in Zen, we're always emphasizing attainment over understanding. In fact, you know, one of the essential things in Zen teaching is understanding is not going to help you. Zen Master Sung is saying that all the time. He's always yelling at me, stop reading books, or you're too clever, you know. So, you know, that's why we do Kongan practice. That's why we do practicing. That's why hopefully you encounter somebody that's not going to teach you something, but it's going to point you in the right direction. So one of these lineage holders, whoever they are, their job is to point you towards having a direct experience. They aren't actually, you might think that they're there to explain something to you. They're not. They're there to push you over the cliffs so you can encounter your true self as you're falling down and hitting the water. So, and that's not a very popular job, which is another reason you might not like your Zen teacher. Because you're doing things, you know, you want a really good explanation so I can go back to whatever, the things I like. But that's not what it's about. It's about pushing you in a particular direction so that you too can have this direct experience. Because Zen particularly emphasizes this direct experience. So the first part of this, you have to attain your true self and then help the world, right? Use that to help the world. So that's what the Buddha did. So in the end, Buddha, you know, when Buddha leaves home, he doesn't move to a library and starts reading Hindu texts or something. And he doesn't, he goes and visits some teachers, but in the end, you know, he's left with, well, God, you know, this is not helping me. I have to actually find out for myself. So Zen is all about finding out for yourself. So hopefully this whole technique of this lineage holder or these masters of one kind or another, that is a technique embedded in a particular culture that's trying to push you over the cliff. So their job is to point out something to you so you'll have a direct experience of it. So when you go into like a Kongan interview, that Kongan interview is not to explain anything to you. In fact, as soon as that teacher starts explaining something to you, you should yell, "Shut up!" Right? So their job and the job of the Kongan, which is used as a technique, is to lead you to have a direct experience of your true self. But that can happen in all kinds of contexts for all kinds of reasons. Some of them seem idiotic, like this blockhead monk Sukdu, who couldn't do anything. He gets enlightenment when his sandals, he slips on the mountain, he's carrying wood down to the temple, and his sandals fly off his feet and come down and hit him on the head. Boom, right? So it's all about pointing you towards having this direct experience. So that's a kind of technique, but you don't want to be attached to the technique, because it's not about technique, it's about having this direct experience. And these kinds of techniques, again, are embedded in a particular cultural tradition. So what's interesting about the Korean one is that it's boiled down to, these days, although this happened quite early, there's only Zen. None of these other Buddhist schools exist there anymore. So everybody there is in the Zen school. And because of that, Korean Buddhism has this very special kind of flavor. So this, it's not that devotional Buddhism doesn't exist. It's just that it's not very emphasized, and it's not a very big part of the whole big deal. But this task of finding your true self, you can be detoured by many, many, many things. It could even be detoured by studying Buddhism. So more important, Buddha didn't study Buddhism. He just looked inside. So looking inside, that's also the so-called lineage holder's job, is to set up a situation where you can do that, provoke you, push you, poke you, hit you over the head, push you in front of a car, maybe, I don't know what it might be, but that's their job. And then if it's successful, you will wake up to yourself and then use that to help the world. So this Korean tradition, we have Korean names. Our Buddhas are, you can see there where Bonhae Zen Master screen is. There's that Buddha there. That's a Korean Buddha, and that's a Korean painting. So all those are Korean style. I happen to like Korean Buddhas are the best, in my opinion, because their eyes always have bone. There's not any of that happy Buddha kind of stuff in Korea. It's all, and that's because the Zen tradition is so strong. So even in the iconography like this, the styles of the altar, the paintings, the Buddhas, all that kind of stuff, even the austerity of a Zen hall, it's called a sanbang. It's not, you wouldn't even know you were in a Buddhist temple in most of the Zen halls I've been in, because they remove all that kind of crap because it's a diversion. So that's the Korean style of Zen. It doesn't tread so much on that. It treads more on practicing and finding your true self, which is what Buddhism should tread on, in my opinion. That's why I like Korean Zen. But Zen Master Seungsang is always also influenced a lot by Japanese Zen, right? So if you look at this Zen master from the middle 1700s, his name is Hakuin. So he kind of revives the Kongan, koan. They'd say koan, they're Japanese. He revised this Kongan tradition in Japan. So Zen Master Seungsang is strongly influenced by that. So, and he also develops his own Kongan style, because sometimes you can get lost in the Kongan and it's not clear what the direction of the Kongan is. But in our school, it's very clear that the Kongan is used to point you towards finding your true self and helping the world. In other words, it's in the context of Mahayana Buddhism. That's why we're called the Kwan school of Zen, right? So a lot of austere kind of samurai style Zen from Korea, they don't like Kuan Yin maybe, but in Korea we like Kuan Yin. but this Kuan Yin thing, Kwan Sean Fosa, is about direction. So it's about finding your true self and helping the world. So it's helping the world part is the Guan Yin part, the Kwansean Bosa part that we use in Korean Buddhism. So the balance between all these different elements will be different in different countries, right? So in China, China is like Sun Sneem used to say, Chinese Zen is kind of like your grandmother giving you warm milk and cookies when you come to visit, right? Well, on the other end of the continuum is Zen, where somebody's going to, stab you with a sword if you don't wake up in 3 seconds. And then in the middle somewhere there, and hopefully with some kind of balance, is Korean Zen, which can play all those different instruments and hopefully make a harmonious sound, which is going to push you towards finding your true self. So that's my take on our Korean tradition. It's interesting to read about these things. Like over the last week or so, I've been refreshing my memory about these things. So I was reading some of these books, and it's really good story. I mean, it was really interesting. One thing you say about Zen is it's not boring, at least. A lot of sutras, when you read them, they're a little bit boring. Of course, they have to always make the same point and have the same meaning back behind. So it's important to do some practicing. So when you read the sutras, in fact, Zen Master Sung Sung said you shouldn't start reading the sutras until after you get enlightenment. If you read them before you get enlightenment, then they become a hindrance, right? Because you'll attach to the words. So it's okay to read after you get enlightenment, it's okay. Right? Because after all, Buddha got enlightenment, then out popped the sutras, right? So if you attach to those sutras, they're actually a hindrance. But Americans don't have that hindrance so much, which is good, because we don't know that much about Buddhism. I forget, we were at a talk someplace at Chogisa, I think in Chogisa, somebody asked them, Master Sung Sung, how can you possibly teach those stupid Americans about Buddhism? I mean, God, give me a break. And he said, no. Americans are much better at Zen than you here in Korea because they don't know anything about Buddhism. That's a benefit. It's not a negative. Because you don't have to erase their tape. So when I'm teaching Buddhism to Koreans, I always have to erase everything they understand so that they can actually connect with Zen. But in the United States, it's not a problem because they don't know anything about Buddhism. So I don't have to push the delete button. They can just start out and do it, right? So that's what he liked about the United States. We were so stupid. So stupidity does have its benefits. So that's Korean Zen and what we get to encounter. So are there any questions?
Yes, Al? I have a question.
Yes.
We hear oftentimes, find true self and then help this world.
Right.
Why not help this world and find true self?
Say again?
Why not help this world and find true self?
Right. So are those two statements the same or different?
That's the question I have.
No, I'm asking you. Because I don't know.
I don't read the sutras yet.
Yeah, so that also is a teaching style, right? So anytime, you have to say something. If Buddha's teaching the 5 ascetics that he was just sitting in the forest with a couple months before, now hating because he split and copped out on them, he has to come up with expedient words to teach them. And then as he was walking towards the area where he was going to give them teaching, he ran into an Indian businessman. He had to teach him. And he's talking to kings, he's talking to beggars. You have to have what we call skillful means, right? To talk to all of those kind of people. So I think what makes a really good teacher is somebody who can talk to all kinds of different people. So those are just teaching phrases that we use. And hopefully you'll see the behind meaning and do what they say rather than attaching to the meaning. So find your true self and help the world, as you indicate, is that it's actually the same phrase repeated twice. Although you may think it's different, or you may reverse it and think, well, I should help the world and then find my true self, which of course is the great Bodhisattva vow, right? So I mean, none of that is contradictory because those are all just teaching words. So you can put them in the blender and make your smoothie and pour it out into your cup and drink it. But it's really important to get the direct taste no matter what ingredients you put in the blender. It actually doesn't make any difference. They could be Taoist ingredients, they could be Christian ingredients, it doesn't make any difference. It's about waking up to what the real meaning back behind is. So that's one of these Taoist elements that's introduced into Chinese Buddhism, and particularly Chinese Zen, from the time of the sixth patriarch. You can see that there's this blending of Taoist and Buddhist teaching. In fact, that's what makes Zen so unique. But then also Confucianism is also absorbed. So if you go to Korean Buddhism, you'll notice there's Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism all together in there, all mushed up together, right? So, but the interesting thing about Korean Zen is that Taoism is never very important in Korea, not near as important as it was in China. So that kind of element is not emphasized as much. But again, the emphasis of all these different things are just developing a teaching style which you can present to the people. So in Korean Buddhism, just like in Tibetan Buddhism, in fact, they're kind of similar actually to me anyway, is this mixture of shamanism and Buddhism, or shamanism and Zen. I remember when I first went, like at this temple, Shinwan Sa was built in 526. At night when we'd sit, these shamans would always come down out of the mountains and rub leaves against the walls of the Zen hall and stuff, just trying to cause trouble. These women shaman, because just above us was a married monk's temple, which is out of a Japanese tradition, the Soto tradition in Japan. And then just up above that was a shaman temple. So you can't tell it's not a Buddhist temple because they look exactly the same until you start talking to the people there. So that temple was occupied by shamans and who are all 99%. They're all females in Korea. So they would come down at night and bug us. Or they would be, while we were doing winter kilche, since they also operate on a lunar calendar, they'd be doing something on their lunar calendar that would match up with something on our lunar calendar. And so they'd be chanting and beating drums and all kinds of stuff, burning pigs or whatever they do. It's amazing. Anyway, that's interesting for a guy from Nebraska,
From Kansas City too.
I mean, I've been around shamans, but they were all Sioux Indians. They were Lakota.
In the Lakotas.
Yeah, we had a
Thank you for your teaching.
Lakota Zen or something. Or Potawatomi Zen. Well, you notice that a lot of the techniques that we use as Buddhists, like beating drums and all that kind of stuff,
very much.
That comes out of a shamanistic tradition. When you go to Korea and people are chanting, the melodies, the rhythms, the instruments, all that kind of stuff will be borrowed from shamanism. It's quite interesting, actually. I mean, one time I think during Kilche, I forget when it was. It was after breakfast, after work period. So we finished work period, then we'd have a little break before you had to start sitting, right? So I go walking up in the mountains and I'm creeping up this stream in the mountains there. Like this is the most famous mountain in Korea, Karyong-san. So I'm creeping up this mountain and I come over this ridge and I look down and there's this male shaman. He's called a Paksu. So he's there at the bottom of the creek and he has this pig's head on this altar and he's doing all this wild chanting and dancing around and stuff. I'm just sitting up there looking down and he's by himself. He's not trying to impress anybody. He's just doing what he does, you know. Wow, that's great. So then I just kind of slithered back down the mountain back and sat. So that would be a different tradition you'd probably see in China, although I don't know. I haven't practiced that much. I mean, all the temples I went to in China, there were no shamans around there, you know. But in Korea, they're always around nearby. Any other questions?
Sanim, I don't
Yep.
think you mentioned, where does the Korean iconography come from? What
Yeah.
rise to, you know, like our fancy paintings and all of that, as opposed to Japanese?
Right, right. So there's some very subtle things about Korean Buddhist iconography is different than Japanese. One thing you'll notice that the altars are always balanced. So a Japanese altar might have like one candle here and something sitting over there, but ours are always balanced. So there's a left and a right and they're in balance. So that's all Korean understanding of feng shui. So, well, the symbolism was originally borrowed from India, and then it becomes Sinified, you know, it becomes Chinese. And then it also, once it moves over to Korea, it assumes Korea style. So if you've been paying attention to how they look, if you go into a Buddha store, you can tell the Buddhas that are Chinese from the ones that are Korean. In fact, most Buddhist stores, unless you're in Korea, won't even have a Korean Buddha. Like this one behind me here on my right, see it right there? That's, if I look at it, I can see right away it's Chinese, it's not Korean. But the one in the picture there on the screen, that one is definitely, that's Korean. So those are just cultural styles, right? I happen to like the Korean one just because the eyes of Korean Buddhas are always very distinctive and very piercing. You probably notice that. Well, if you don't go to other kinds of temples, you might not notice. But if you go to a Theravadan temple or something, you know, it's all just, you know, like happy monks sitting under trees or something. Or Korean ones are. I think that's because of their Zen tradition. Right? So I've been to like the Six Patriarchs Temple north of Guangzhou. The Buddhas there are also very kind of soft. It's okay. The Six Patriarchs mummy is a little scary, but everything else there is pretty, you know, because they also practice devotional practices there at Namwa. That's called Namwa Tzu. Namwa Tzu. Southern Flower Temple. So that's where the Sixth Patriarch lived. But if you go to, I can't remember. Well, I've been to so many Buddhist temples in China, I can't remember. But they're all different because they have different styles. I'd have to look back at some of the pictures on my phone. Maybe I could see something. But even within Korea, you know, there will be different styles that you'll see as you go around all the temples, because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of temples all over the place, and they all different styles, and some of them can be 1,500 years old, or at least there's been a temple on that site for 1,500 years. One thing about walking around this temple there on we are, where Musang Sa is on Karyong-san. As you walk around there, you'll see these destroyed temples. So there will be like marble columns that are crushed and just laying on the ground and stuff, where there used to be a temple there like 1,000 years ago or something. I mean, to somebody from Nebraska, that's pretty shocking. Well, wait a minute, maybe that should be in a museum or something. You don't quite know. And then you go to these cities, like we used to go to Kongju, which used to be the capital of Pekche. So a lot of Japanese Buddhism comes from these Pekche monks that went there in the year 600, right? So they kind of actually took Zen to Japan in the year 600. So where we practice there, where Musang Sa is, and where we on the other side of the mountain, where Shinwan Sa was, where I used to lead retreats, those are kind of the root temples of Japanese Zen are there, because that's where the monks came who fled there when all those different kingdoms were united around the year 600, roughly speaking. So yeah, the study of Buddhist iconography and all those different styles, you could spend years doing that, but it's fun to look at it and see it. It's interesting. It's supposed to be inspirational. It's not, our iconography is not to be prayed to, but to stir this great question inside of you. So Zen Master Sung, a lot of people would ask Zen Master Sung Sung, why do we bow to the Buddha, right? So if you ask that of a Chinese Buddhist, say in Singapore, the ones that aren't asleep anyway, you'll see that you'll see that they're like praying to Buddhism. But Korean Buddhism has a really long and very strong, this is not pray Buddhism, you're not praying to anything. So when somebody asks Zen Master Sung Sung, when we bow to the Buddha, what are we doing? So behind that question might be, well, are we bowing to try to get something, Am I putting $10 on the altar so I can get my son into Harvard? What the hell am I doing? But in our tradition, when you bow, you just bow, right? So that's just do it. Just do it is your true self. Your true self is not a thing, it's a do it, right? So you always think that things are separate when they're just one, right? So the idea of this whole thing is to show you that everything is one thing, it's not two things. So there's nothing to pray to, and there's no place to go, right? So when the monk asked Huineng, the sixth patriarch, where is the Western paradise? Of course, he says, well, it's inside you, of course. It's your true self. It's just another name for your true self, the Western paradise. It isn't down over there someplace over Wichita or something. It's actually right in here. Well, we say in here, but in here doesn't have inside and outside. So already I made a mistake by opening my mouth. So that's why a Zen consideration of iconography is much different than like regular Buddhists or something, So that's why Doksan can burn the sutras in the middle of the Buddha hall and everybody gets upset. Well, he's doing it for a reason. Or that laywoman can sit on the altar and be the Buddha. What's her name? I forgot. Korean. Anyway, so all this kind of stuff goes on, but whatever they're doing, they're trying to point towards your true self and not have you get attached to all this external stuff. So yeah, that's a great looking altar. I really love it. And it's called a Tenghwa. The painting back behind came from Korea. And it's cool if you look at it. It's got the 4 kings and all the bodhisattvas and all that kind of stuff. It's got the 10 great monks, and it's got Shakyamuni Buddha. It's Shakyamuni Buddha. Yeah, Shakyamuni Buddha. And, but it can contain all kinds of stuff. But all that stuff for us who aren't so bright is really good because they all mean the same thing. And there's got the 4 elements. It's got earth, which is the which is the powder inside the incense burner. It's got fire, which is the candles. It's got air. It's got water. You know, it's got
What's
all
the rice represent?
good food, right? The rice is an offering.
Okay.
So, so all those things, the altar is just everything. And then Buddha's sitting on it, blah, blah, blah. I was trying to remember what at this Shinwan-sa temple, did we have, I don't think we had it. No, we had an altar, it just didn't have, oh, it had a mirror. So it just have a, like traditional Zen altars in Korea are like a mirror and maybe a little incense burner, or a mirror on the wall, and an altar, which is mostly just like a shelf, you know, attached to the wall. There's nothing underneath it. And then an incense burner. You know, so when you're doing walking meditation, if you want to get a quick look at yourself, you just look right real quick when you walk by the altar. You get to see who's there. So that would be a traditional Zen hall, which is called Sonbong in Korean. Zen, a chan, what is it in Chinese? Chan tang style altar in Korea, which is simple, simple, simple. You know, they're trying to get rid of all the iconography so you don't get all wrapped up in that stuff. So you're just sitting there looking at a floor with a few shamans rattling outside. And that's about it. Any other questions?
Could you say something about traditional temples in Korea? And they have many buildings, and those buildings serve separate functions,
Yeah.
and they look quite different. So
Yeah.
could you talk about that?
So traditionally there are temple grounds, you know. So when we went to India, we went to where Shariputra was buried near Nalanda University. So it's this huge, huge, huge place, right? And it's got all these different buildings to all this different stuff, monks' residence halls, and all this stuff. So there's this tradition of having like this, it's like a campus, right? So if you go up here to the KU campus, there's an administration building, and across the street or next to it is the math building, if I remember correctly. Down the street is where I used to be in Fraser Hall. And then across the street is where Professor Lombardo had his office, you know. So there, and that's true of Buddhist temples too. So there'll be a main altar. So usually in our Zen halls we have like this kind of thing that's in the picture there. It's like kind of like the altar in the main Buddha hall. So that's the main chanting hall. Then there'll be a separate building, which is like the Zen hall, the Sanpan. So in some places, those Zen monks do not chant. So during the Kilche time, they just sit in the Zen hall and that's all they do. They eat there, they sleep there, they do everything there. Although in some temples, it depends on the tradition, they might go over to the main Buddha hall and chant. We did that once in a while during Kilche, like at Buddha's Enlightenment Day, Buddha's birthday, just before the end of Kilche. So, and then there's one thing that's unique about Korean temples is they'll have a temple building to the mountain god. And the mountain god is that guy with the long beard that's sitting on top of a tiger. He's riding a tiger. So Chinese Buddhism doesn't have that, and Japanese Buddhism doesn't have it, but Korean Buddhism has it. So what Shinwan saw was the national mountain god temple building. It's part of Shinwan temple's thing. So this is where the, who is it, Taegu? I forget his name, the founder of the Shila dynasty. His wife would go there and pray to the mountain god. So it's like over 1,000 years old. So there will be all these different things. So there's offices, like the monks that run the monastery have to have their offices. Like even here in our Zen Center, I'm pointing right towards it, we have an office, right? So there'll be office buildings, and there'll be residence halls where the monks live. There'll be like a mess hall. There will be like there might be a hall for Amitabha Buddha. There might be one for Kwanzaa Bosa, and then there'll definitely be one for doing funerals. So that's where the temple makes its money, at that one where you do chanting for dead people. So that will usually be quite ornate and quite nice. I remember at Sudoksa, where Mangong Snim lived, I did a 100-day ceremony for my mother at their funeral hall. It's really nice. It's right next to that. The oldest, in fact, I think it's maybe the oldest standing building in all of Asia, is the Buddha Hall at Sudoksa. And it was built in the 12th century or something, and it's still standing. It's amazing. They're really nice. I mean, when you go in there, you get a really nice feeling, because it's really boom. It's been there, hasn't gone away. But right next to that is the funerary place. I forget what that hall's called. I used to know this stuff, but I forgot. So there'll be all these different functions, like in this Nanchuan kills the cat, remember? So he kills the cat when the monks of the eastern side of the monastery and the western side are fighting about a cat. So Buddhist monks are allowed to have cats. They're not allowed to have dogs, but they can't have cats. So they had a cat. I guess they were fighting about it. So there were residence halls on the eastern side and the western side. So all this comes from China. So there's a long tradition about how buildings are arranged in this campus based on this Chinese model. And the Koreans follow that Chinese model. So there will be some monks living on the eastern side and some living on the western side. And then feng shui determines how the temple is lined up, right? So you want to have a black turtle back behind your temple, theoretically. And then in front of your temple, there'll be a red bird. So if you go to like Sudoksa, where Mangong Snim was, we used to do Kilche there too, before we moved to Shinwansa. It has incredible feng shui. So the black turtle is what's it called? I forgot. Soksan or something. This famous mountain in Korea. And then if you look straight south, you see this other mountain. I forget what it's called too, but that's the red bird. So they're always thinking about those things, about particularly Koreans, just like with the altar, everything is balanced. Sansanim, when we go to Japan, he's always criticizing the way the temple's laid out. This temple's laid out all wrong. Look at the feng shui, it's terrible, right? Because Koreans are really into feng shui, even more than Chinese, as near as I can tell. Although it's a Chinese art, Chinese Taoist art.
So is there a better side to be on? So in other words, the front of the temple is always facing south, right? Ideally.
It doesn't necessarily have to be. There's a lot of old temples in Korea from previous dynasties which point north, actually. So yeah, but generally speaking, that would be nice.
I mean, given that it should be aligned north and south somehow, is there a better side to be on, east or west? Are the senior, monks on one side or the other, or?
I don't know about that. One side's the tiger side, and the other side's the, let's see, what is it? I forget. I used to know all this feng shui stuff. I forgot though. But yeah, there's a system of adjudicating that issue. But I don't know what it is. You know, it's just a cultural style. You know? So what are the one side is the white tiger? I don't know. There's left, right, front, back, this, that. Zen Master Song is really good at that. So if you go to like Diamond Hill Zen Monastery, you'll notice the feng shui there is like the best. But he picked that exact spot. And we were always building new buildings to balance out the feng shui, which is always screwed up there. So we built that 7-story pagoda in the parking lot. So everybody's complaining, hey, you can't build a pagoda in the parking lot. Where are we going to park our cars? Right? says, well, if we don't build this pagoda, there won't be anybody coming here to use the parking lot because the feng shui will be all screwed up. So we built this big pagoda in the main parking lot. Then the main parking lot got, of course, moved to the back because we have lots of land there. But all those things are laid out to give you a good feeling inside, you know, so you're not. But originally, all that stuff is just foo-foo, you know, because your true self doesn't care about any of that stuff. It can practice across from Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue if it wants to, right? Might not be the best feng shui, but you can do it.
Sunil?
You can read books about that if you're interested in feng shui. It's kind of interesting. Yes, yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned in passing, I think it was Mangang, and sort of, well, everybody knows about that. So not everybody does know about Kyung Ho, Mangang, um, Kobang. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about our immediate lineage and who those people were. Especially this is going to be up on YouTube, and a lot of people will come to it and they'll have no idea.
Well, first of all, I suggest reading books about because there's quite long biographies of them in books. And they're famous characters in not only Buddhist culture, but also Korean culture. So around the end of the 1800s, this teacher, Kim Hosanim, who gets enlightenment after seeing these dead people in the village, he is the one who rejuvenates Korean Buddhism. And this is also about the time that the Japanese are moving into Korea, because there's this Sino-Japanese war that the Chinese lose, and that allows all these Japanese troops to come into that area, and they also start moving into the Korean peninsula. So he's raised up in that time, and he's living in the temple at that time. He becomes a monk at that time, and he also gets enlightenment at that time there at Donghaksa near Daejeon in Korea, south of Seoul, about 135 miles south of Seoul. So he's the rejuvenator and reestablisher of this Korean Zen lineage that we're part of now. So that's pretty, I mean, in terms of the history of Buddhism, that's quite close. Like that's, that's like 100 years ago or so, right? And then his student is Mangang Sanim, and he's also a real strong guy. So he's famous for opposing the Japanese attempts to make Buddhist monks and nuns not Buddhist monks and nuns, to make them lay people. So when the Japanese move into Korea, they're opposed by the Buddhists, because Buddhist monks will take up arms to defend the country. They have a long tradition of doing that. And so one thing they tried to do to weaken Korean society, because they're getting a lot of opposition, obviously, from Koreans, they tried to weaken Buddhism, and they try to weaken. One of their techniques is to force all the monks to become lay people, because if they do that, then they have to spend time with their wives, raising their kids, making a living. They can't do all this crap to oppose the Japanese. So. So Mongong Sanim is famous for resisting that. One time a Japanese military colonel, a ruler, the military ruler in his area held a gun to his head, ordering him to stop being a monk. Then he said, well, if you kill me, you'll go to hell for 1,000 lifetimes or something. And he said it with no fear or anything, just looked the guy in the eye and said, if you do that, this and this will happen. The guy and left. So he was able to preserve during this whole time that the Japanese were there, this monastic tradition. And of course, he's famous for building this Kwangsangam, this famous nuns temple. I mean, the nuns temple is much bigger than the monks temple there at Sudokso. We used to go there for lunch during Kilche. They have a really interesting technique. Like, we sit down for lunch. It's this beautiful lunch with all this incredible Korean food. I mean, Koreans have really good food. And they serve it, and we sit down, and they hit the chukpi to eat, and then just as I'm picking up my chopsticks to eat something, they hit the chukpi, the meal's over. These are Korean Zen nuns. So they're usually 100 times stronger than the monks, but everybody knows that, right? So that's Mongong. He's at Sudokso. So he builds this temple. He stays there for 50 years. And that's where we were. But then the guy that was head of that temple, I won't mention his name, kicked us out because he didn't want the Americans being there or something. I can't remember what. So then we moved to Shinwansa, right? So anyway, Mongong's top student was Kobong Sanim. So Kobong Sanim is this Confucian Taoist scholar who kind of converts to Buddhism. And he also fights the Japanese. So he's Sung Sung's teacher, but he's the one that refused to teach monks because he thought that they were arrogant and lazy. So he only had one monk who got permission from him, Zen Master Sung Sung. Did one, he also gave transmission to one nun. So he gave transmission to our teacher, Zen Master Sung Sung, and he's the one that told Zen Master Sung Sung to go spread Buddhism throughout the world. So that's why he came to the United States. That was like the job that Kobong Sanim gave him. So that's our near up lineage. Right? So those people are quite inspiring, just the example of their life, because they were always living on the edge, they're going to be killed or something. They don't have any food. They practice no matter what, and they're also very, very good teachers. I particularly like Kobong Sanim, although we don't know much about him because he destroyed all of his, he was a great poet, but he destroyed all of his poetry and stuff before he died. He did have, the Japanese had tortured him so his leg wouldn't bend correctly, so he could never sit cross-legged. But just before he died, he broke his own leg so he could sit cross-legged. So he broke his own leg so he could sit cross-legged, and then he died sitting cross-legged. So that's a pretty a pretty tough guy. God. So he was at Wagesa, you know, so when you go to Seoul, our the temple we're associated with in Seoul is Wagesa. And that's where Kobong Sanim lived. I used to live in Kobong Sanim's room for a while. It's a very nice temple, very old too, old place, very good feng shui too. It faces east, just like the Zen Center here in Lawrence. It faces east, the altar. So it's the same as Wagesa. It also faces east, but it all works. It's about you, not the feng shui, unfortunately, for most people. So let's see, Kobong Sanim died in 1961, about the time I was graduated from high school. And Mongong Sanim died right after the Japanese left, so-called left Korea. So he was, at the time he died, he was rebuilding all these temples that had been destroyed and stuff. I think he died in 1946 or 47, something like that. So anyway, you can read, and if you want to know more about them, I would suggest getting like Dropping Ashes on the Buddha, those kind of books. Whole World is a Single Flower. There's this book by one of our monks called Mu Son Sunim, who wrote a book called Thousand Peaks. It has a whole bunch of information about this kind of stuff. And it'll point towards all kinds of other stuff. Like there's a lot of, I don't even know what the most recent books are, but I'm sure there's recent ones about all this stuff too.
Richard Schrobe has a very good book.
Okay, what's it called?
I'll look it up first. Hold on a second.
Okay, then there's a book called 60 Years of Just Doing It, which is a whole bunch of reflections on Zen Master Seung from his students, both in Korea, Japan, and here in the United States. That one's very good too.
How many years of just doing it?
What? 60 years of just doing it.
60. Okay.
Oh, yeah, right.
The Richard Schrobe's book is Don't Know Mind, The Spirit of Korean Zen. And
Yeah,
he
there you
talks about going all the way back. He talks about Kyungho Mangang and Kobong and Sungsan, but he also talks about Taego and Matsu Chitsang and the early Korean masters. I don't know if he.
Yeah, Taego is the inheritor of the Zen tradition in Korea from Lin Chi.
Right.
So Korean Zen actually goes back before Lin Chi. So another interesting thing about Korea Buddhism and its style is that they trace their origins back to the sixth patriarch. So they don't have this division between Soto and Rinzai, the Lin Chi and the Saotong style. So they have just six, they call themselves six patriarch style, right? So there's no Dongshan versus Lin Chi supposedly thing going on, because they go back further. So that's a kind of element that's there present in Korean Zen that you might not know about, but it's a big deal to Koreans because, you know, since they're the small guy on the block, they're always trying to get an angle on their neighbors. And it's true too.
Sanim, who did you say wrote A Thousand Peaks?
Mu, M-U, Song, S-E-O-N-G. Mu Song.
I believe it's S-O-E-N-G.
Oh, E-O-N-G, yeah. These days it would probably just be O-N-G. I don't know. They're always changing the transliteration. You know? And if you look at those books, they'll point you to other books if you're interested in it. I mostly like the stories. I never cared for sutras much. And the most interesting sutras are the ones that have stories in them, right? Like the Platform Sutra. And the most interesting parts of the Platform Sutra are the stories, not the Buddhist metaphysics and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's okay, but the stories are much more interesting. People are chasing him around, always trying to kill him and stuff. It's more like a Wild West movie than it is a philosophical discourse, which will put you to sleep in about 5 minutes. And our temple there, Musangsa, near Taejin, it has very, very good feng shui too. The geomancy there is incredible. Zen Master Sungzong picked that site. It's called Manjusri, who's the Bodhisattva wisdom. It's called Manjusri wisdom. So energy. So mainly in Buddhism, there's two different rough distinctions about energy flowing through a temple. So Providence Zen Center has Kuan Yin, Kuan Bosal energy, while our temple there at Musangsa has Manjusri energy. So it's kind of like Zhonghaesa up above Sudoksa, while Sudoksa is a little more settled down. But both of those are still Manjusri style. If you go to Mongong Sanim's hermitage that looks towards the east, it's built right on a cliff. So it definitely has Manjusri energy, right? Any other questions? Well, that's probably enough of that. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I hope if you're not interested in it, at least you have a little background. And if you are interested in it, you can look at the books some more. There's this guy, what's his name? Robert Boswell or something. He used to be
Robert Boswell.
He used to be a Korean,
Well.
he used to be a Korean monk, but he stopped, married an ex-nun, I think. Anyway, he wrote this big book on Chinul. You can read that.
There was also the collected works of Tego are available, and that's quite old. And there's a wonderful book by Martine Batchelor with the odd title of Women in Korean Buddhism. And it's basically her autobiography as someone who was a Western nun in Korea. And then the second half is an as told to autobiography of one of the most prominent nuns in Korea in the early 20th century. And that's quite a good book, Women in Korean Buddhism.
Who is that?
That's Martine Batchelor.
No. Who's the most famous Korean?
One of the most famous, Sun Gong, I believe her name was. She was a student of Mongong.
Yeah. So there's many of them. If you see those pictures of Mongong sitting there with those nuns.
Yeah, Mongong was very famous for actually giving transmission to women. Not many people did that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Sunim. Maybe everyone could unmute. Oh, there's another question?
Yes.
Yeah, would it be possible to get a bibliography of some kind in an email? A list of all the books that you've mentioned and that Zen Master Dae has just mentioned as well?
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't know.
Yeah, we will put something together on request. You'll have to request it, but sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.